So anyways, my name is Logan White. I do work with you students here, if you couldn't tell. I do apologize. My voice is like right on the edge of giving out, so if I start cracking, it's probably not because I'm crying. It's probably just because of that. But welcome. Get out of here, Chris, all right? The call and responsiveness of the church today, it's a new level. Anyways, we are continuing in our series, Who is Jesus? And I really love this message for us today here. This family, this series has been so good for us, focusing in on who Jesus is, and also importantly, who we are in light of who Jesus is. Jesus, the person who I want to share with you guys constantly, this is the most important and significant life-changing relationship we can have in our lives, by truly knowing and experiencing this Jesus that we're talking about. We've been reading at Luke. We've been in Luke looking at different interactions Jesus has with different people and different things that Jesus does that reveal to us who this fascinating God/man is. So as you go through this series and as we talk today and as we continue to go through it, I want to spark this question for you personally. I want you guys to ask, as Nate asked during the greeting time, who is Jesus? Right? Who is Jesus for you personally? Maybe who has Jesus been for you in the past? Maybe who is Jesus for you now? Is there a difference? What is that difference? And as we have looked at and processed through the narrative of Jesus in the book of Luke, is your narrative of Jesus matching? Is it actually matching what the Bible says about who Jesus is? That's what I want us to think through as we go through today. The thoughts that I think Jesus wants us to consider when we come face to face with him is really, man, who is this Jesus, and who am I in relationship to him? What does that relationship look like? So let's have that thought in the forefront of our minds as we read through Luke chapter 12 today. Right, Jesus is still in this same conversation / kind of speech that he has been in, that we've been talking about for the past 3 weeks as we've gone through Luke chapter 12. So it's the same conversation, same kind of dialogue going through it. And Jesus continues this conversation. Firstly, Chris talked about this when he addresses the Pharisees and talking about hypocrisy. Right? And Jesus develops this pattern in Luke 12. First, he talks about hypocrisy, and then he tells us this parable of the rich fool, which we talked about 2 weeks ago when I talked last. And then Jesus tells us, as Nate talked about last week, to not be anxious, to not be as worried about providing for ourselves, because God is a provider. But Jesus is really changing things in this. He's saying, don't be so focused on possessions. Don't find value in possessions. Don't find life in possessions. Find life in me. Or don't be a hypocrite with how it comes to how we consider our possessions. Don't be a hypocrite in how we worry and have anxiety and we don't trust that God is a provider. Don't try to navigate through life on our own provision. And what I would propose here is that Jesus is coming to us and he's offering us, he's commanding us, and he's inviting us into a paradigm shift in our lives in Luke chapter 12. Right? A paradigm shift or a change in our world view. I don't know, worldview is a very Christian-y kind of word. At least I learned a ton at CBU in college. If I can explain the word worldview, I would explain that as something like the lens in which we all experience life. Right? We all go through life as if we were wearing sunglasses with a certain tint to the glasses in them, to the shades. We all go through life, and we see things a certain way based off the worldview that we have. Right, if you guys are wearing pink sunglasses and you guys go and look at the sunset's going to look different than if you're wearing black ones or blue ones or no sunglasses. Right, your worldview will change depending on what you are looking through. Right, how you look at life, every little thing that happens is filtered through our own personal worldview. So Jesus in Luke chapter 12 is, I think, speaking right to the core here of our default worldview, largely. How many of us, naturally at least, go through life and live out our lives and the way that we see the world in terms of what's important and what's not important, what's valuable and what's not valuable. We go through the world asking ourselves these questions: what can I buy for myself that's going to make me happy? What can I acquire for myself that's going to take better care of me? What's a new thing that will make me feel valuable? Right? Have you guys thought about that this week? Probably. I know I have had these thoughts. How do we think about this too? Like how providing for ourselves leads into this? How worried we are about what the world may and may not do to us? How worried we are about providing ourselves the lives that we think that we need or the lives that we think that we see other people having? Anxious about what other people think or may not think about us? And that sounds pretty close to like our default setting to me, even if it's just subconsciously what we're going through. How much of our lives are dominated and filled with moments where our thoughts are just like that, where we're tracking through life with that worldview. Jesus says we need a paradigm shift, a change in our worldview where we are much less focused on these things, the worries of the world, and much more focused on his kingdom. The end of Nate's passage last week, we read through this part of Luke chapter 12, verse 32 through 34. If you guys want to open your Bibles there, we'll be there all today. But Jesus says this in verse 32, "Do not be afraid, little flock, for your Father has been pleased to give you the kingdom. Sell your possessions and give to the poor. Provide purses for yourselves that will not wear out, a treasure in heaven that will never fail, where no thief comes near, no moth destroys. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." This is a paradigm shift. This is a worldview change. Treasures in heaven opposed to treasures here on earth. Number one, you guys note today, Jesus in Luke 12 is offering us a new worldview, a paradigm shift from our life before Christ and life with him. We've mentioned this every week, as I did today, that we believe a relationship with Jesus is the most important and life-changing thing that we can experience here in this world. And an important note about a relationship and life with Jesus is that it is life-changing. It changes our lives. Our lives should, can, and will change and look different when we are living in light of who Jesus is and in obedience to what he calls us to do. Our worldview, along with many other things, will change, and they can, and they will, and they should change. So to highlight what this paradigm shift looks like, on our passage today, Jesus is continuing in verse 34 of Luke 12, giving us a parable demonstrating what this shift should look like. A way that we should live, a new worldview, if you will. Right, it's a longer passage here, so if you guys can follow along with me, it'll be on the screen as well. But starting in Luke 12, verse 35. Jesus says this, "Be dressed and ready for service, and keep your lamps burning, like servants waiting for their master to return from a wedding banquet, so that when he comes and knocks, they can immediately open the door for him. It will be good for those servants whose master finds them watching when he comes. Truly, I tell you, he will dress himself to serve, will have them recline at the table, and will come and wait on them. It will be good for those servants whose master finds them ready, even if he comes in the middle of the night or towards daybreak. But understand this, if the owner of the house had known at what hour the thief was coming, he would not have let his house be broken into. You also must be ready, because the Son of Man will come at an hour when you do not expect him." Verse 41, Peter asked, "Lord, are you telling this parable to us or to everyone?" The Lord answered, "Who then is the faithful and wise manager, whom the master puts in charge of his servants to give them their food allowance at the proper time? It will be good for that servant whom the master finds doing so when he returns. Truly, I tell you, he will put him in charge of all of his possessions. But suppose the servant says to himself, 'My master is taking a long time in coming,' and he then begins to beat the other servants, both men and women, and to eat and drink and get drunk. The master of that servant will come on a day when he does not expect him, and at an hour he is not aware of. He will cut him to pieces and assign him a place with the unbelievers. The servant who knows the master's will and does not get ready or does not do what the master wants will be beaten with many blows. But the one who does not know and does things deserving punishment will be beaten with few blows. For everyone who has been given much, much will be demanded. And from the one who has been entrusted with much, much more will be asked. Here is the background underlying truth of this passage. Jesus is returning. And both of these parables highlight this idea of a master coming back to his household. The truth behind this is that Jesus is returning. We often talk about Jesus returning, or as the second coming of Jesus, in almost like this kind of metaphorical way in the church, or even like in a way like, well, maybe someday kind of thing. But this is what Jesus promises and what the Bible affirms over and over again, that Jesus is returning. And we think about this in terms of the book of Revelation, and which is packed with metaphors and is hard to understand and it's hard to read. And so a lot of times we just kind of don't want to deal with it. We prefer to avoid it. However, Jesus himself and throughout the New Testament, it is clear that he is returning, that he will come again. Not to die as he did the first time, but to complete the story and the narrative, if you will. And he will come with glory and with power. He'll usher in this new age, this final creation that God will do, where he'll bring together heaven and earth. And Jesus promises that the second coming will happen. I just gave you guys a 20-second breakdown of what many people could easily spend 200 hours debating and talking about. The intricacies of what it might look like when Jesus comes again. However, the Bible is really relatively scarce on details in terms of what it will look like when Jesus comes again or when it will happen. But it's incredibly affirming, and it's all over the place, that Jesus will return. Right? Our King will come back again at a time that we don't know and in a way that we can't totally be sure of. Which brings me to my second point, that Jesus is less interested in telling us the details of his return than he is insistent on us knowing that he will be returning. Right? That's the thing that's important here. I think all the time Christians kind of miss the forest for the trees when it comes to Jesus' return. We do that so oftentimes in a very public way too. Right? Even in my life, it seems to me like many times I've experienced these times where when pastors and theologian kind of guys get together, there's nothing they seem to talk about more than their different views, different worldviews on what Jesus' second coming might look like. They throw around big words like premillennial, postmillennial, amillennial, pre-trib, mid-trib, post-trib. These are all these theological words that we use to describe what we might think Jesus' second coming will look like. It can be such a talking point where we miss the truth that he is coming, regardless of what it looked like. The other way that Christians do this in the same kind of light is they often talk about the second coming with kind of doom and gloom, almost as like a cudgel to beat other people with. Don't you know Jesus is coming back? He's going to punish people. You guys have read those kind of posts on Facebook, on Instagram. You guys have seen people holding those kind of signs. But what I think Jesus is most concerned about here is not what we think we know about what the second coming will look like, or that we would constantly be reminding other people about it, but that Jesus wants us, like the good servant, reminding ourselves and living in light of the fact that my master, my king, my God is returning, will someday return and hold me to account for my actions. And I need to live and act in a way that I'm prepared, that I'm expecting. I know that he is coming again, and he could come at any second, in a time, in a way that we don't totally know. Now, that is the nugget of truth I think we need to walk away from today with, no matter what, that sense of urgency that should be developed in us. Because he is returning at a time that we don't know, right? If we just had a countdown timer, we'd be like, well, I got time, right? I got 20 minutes on the clock. I'll start doing it with 10 minutes left, right? This is like me classically all through college. Hey, the final paper is due on the last day of the semester, which means I have a lot of days to do absolutely nothing. And I have about 20 hours to finish the paper right before it's due, right? I mean, this is the pattern we do so often in our lives. Even the most driven among us, no one's turning in the final paper 2 weeks into the class, right? I mean, we all are hey, I got time, right? It's coming later. And that is the thing that I think is fascinating, that God didn't give us this clear picture so that we could develop this sense of urgency, because we so easily slip into passivity and just carelessness with this. Now, we have a crisis of Christians not living life in light of this truth, with no sense of urgency, with like kind of this idea of like someday I'll get my life on track, someday I'll write that final paper. And Jesus says there are two different kinds of servants in this passage, as we read. The first one is the ones who are living and prepared for the master's return, who is ready day and night at the door for his master to knock so he can welcome him back to his house. Now, you can imagine this servant keeping the house in perfect order all the time so that it's ready, because he has no idea when his master will return. But he has the desire to serve his master well, to do good by him, and he's obedient to that. And notice the master's response when he does return and he sees the servants prepared for him. In verse 37, it says, "It will be good for the servants whose master finds them watching when he comes. Truly, I tell you, he will dress himself to serve, will have them recline at the table, and will come and wait on them." Notice this dichotomy here, that God constantly shows us this pattern that I see throughout the Bible and throughout our lives, where God asks us for obedience. He does explicitly. I mean, that is the thing God asks us for. Maybe even drastic obedience, asks us to do something really hard to be obedient to. And in return, he absolutely disrupts what the relationship between a God and a servant, a king and a servant, what our relationship with God should look like. He totally throws that on its head. I think we're really comfortable, at least I am, with this idea of me serving God as a servant, right? That makes sense to me, right? God gives me a list of things to accomplish. I accomplish those things. I am the good servant. That's a comfortable kind of position. But his response to the servant's faithfulness is to take his place, to allow the servants to rest and for himself to serve them. And what a wild example God is setting for us. Number 3 in your notes is when God asks us for obedience, he always outweighs the difficulty with his immense love for us. Jesus redefines and reshapes our relationship with him, with his love and in response to our obedience. It's like that phrase that we use with kids sometimes of like, hey, careful of that kid. If you give him an inch, he'll take a mile. Now the call and response is terrible. Earlier on, I'm getting heckled everywhere. Come on. Yeah, give them an inch and they take? Thank you. All right. A foot. Yeah, that's never true, by the way. But it's like this phraseology we use, right? This description of like, hey, if you give this kid a little bit of space, he's going to take everything, right? You can't give him much wiggle room at all because he'll take more than he should. But it's like reversed on its head with God, right? When we give God even small amounts of obedience, small steps towards him, he responds to our inches with miles, huge amounts of love, overwhelming amounts of meaning, servanthood, and simply the best way that we are designed to live are inches for God's miles of depth. It's such a worthwhile trade-off. And here's the thing that I've been processing through a lot recently. Me and my friend Jacob, who just walked in from vacation, good to see you, man. We've been talking about this a lot recently, and I'm excited about it. Oftentimes at church and in Christian circles, we say something along the lines of this, right? Jesus never promised the Christian life will be easier, right? In fact, he says that the road he calls us onto is a harder path. It's more difficult. Things in this kind of tread, right? You guys have all had those kind of conversations or heard those things, right? The Christian life is hard. It's so hard. And it is true, right? Jesus promises us trials and that the world will hate us as they hated him. There absolutely will be obstacles and challenges to the Christian life. Or look at the servants of the house, right? They had to spend all night up at the house, keeping the house in order, getting ready, sitting by the door, waiting for the master to return, not falling asleep, right? This is like, it makes their day harder, right? The obedience that this master's calling them, it makes their life more difficult. I think that's a pretty close corollary to the Christian life that we live, but the master's response to them is to take the burden off of their shoulders in a way that they don't deserve. Right? The servants serving their master well doesn't mean that they're not servants, right? I mean, this is like the relationship that he totally flips on his head. It's like just because you do a job well doesn't mean you get to switch jobs with your boss. You know? This is the relationship that he redefines. Right? They're still his servants, even if they do their job well. And that's what I want our conversations around the Christian life to look like, a paradigm shift, if you will, that while the struggles and trials are real, the obedience can and is hard, the payout is massive. Right? It's a huge payout to be obedient to God. It's the best and most perfect way that we can live the life that God offers us. It's not all doom and gloom. It's not all miserable trying to follow Jesus. And I think that's a worldview change that we need to put in front of this, as well as, man, it should be exciting for me to do these things. And I see payoffs. Man, when I am a good husband to Alyssa in the way that God describes and tells me I should be, my marriage is better. It is easier. It's not harder because I'm being obedient to God. God pays out these things in incredible depth, practically, tangibly, but also, man, the depth that he offers you in relationship to him, that the master stepping off of his position to come and to serve you, man. So we have these good servants, right, who are ready for the master. The master rewards them by elevating them above their deserved position. And then Jesus goes on to describe the master's response to these bad servants, right, in a different situation, these servants who aren't prepared for him. And I love Peter's little interruption here that he inserts. He asks the question that I said 2 weeks ago. Whenever we see these parables, we should always ask the question is, who are we in the story? Right? Who is Jesus talking to? He asked Jesus, is this parable talking to us, or is it talking to the crowds, right? Is it talking to everyone else around them? And I find Jesus' answer fascinating because he doesn't answer it directly, at least. He answers with another parable. He tells them again this picture of a good and bad servant, right? One who is faithful to take care of his master's household while he is away, and one who abuses the trust of the master, and he abuses the servants and takes advantage of his position. So to answer the disciples' question, who is he addressing here? Is he addressing everyone, or is he addressing just his disciples? Is interesting. And I think he is addressing everyone. But he is, I think, specifically targeting the worldview of the disciples, and therefore us. The urgency of living life faithfully for the master to return. He sets the standard for the disciples here. Right? That is the challenge for them and for us. And in verse 47, he says, the servant who knows the master's will and does not get ready or does not do what the master wants will be beaten by many blows. But the one who does not know and does things deserving punishment will be beaten with fewer blows. For everyone who has been given much, much will be demanded. And from the one who has been entrusted with much, much more will be asked. And we've been given an incredible amount. I mean, that the inches for miles exchange that God gives us, we've been given an incredible amount by God. So much that the grace that we have received, it's costly. This is like a thing that, this dynamic between us and God, that it costs something for the master to serve his servants. Grace is costly. One of my favorite books ever is The Cost of Discipleship by Dietrich Bonhoeffer. I've quoted it many times before, and I read this quote to myself frequently. He's a German theologian from the early 1900s. In his book, The Cost of Discipleship, he describes this idea of costly grace. And he says this, costly grace is the gospel, which must be sought again and again and again. The gift which must be asked for, the door at which a man must knock. Such grace is costly because it calls us to follow, and it is grace because it calls us to follow Jesus Christ. It is costly because it cost a man his life, and it is grace because it gives a man the only true life. It is costly because it condemns sin, and grace because it justifies the sinner. Above all, it is costly because it cost God the life of his Son. You were bought at a price, and what has cost God much cannot be cheap for us. Above all, it is grace because God did not reckon his Son too dear a price to pay for our life, but delivered him up for us. And costly grace is the incarnation of God. Jesus said, from everyone who much has been given, much will be demanded. And from the one who has been entrusted with much, much more will be asked. I started today talking about this paradigm shift Jesus is challenging us with in Luke 12, culminating, I think, in this passage largely where we just read how Jesus challenges our love and desire to find value in our pursuit of possessions and things, challenges our love and desire to try to find value in our ability to provide for ourselves, and ultimately challenging our obsession with the ease of life and pursuing life found here in this earthly kingdom opposed to life found in Jesus, life found in his kingdom. And that's the crisis we face in the American church and in our church today with ourselves is that we acknowledge that our king is returning. I don't know any Christians who are like, oh, that's not going to happen. I'm sure they're out there, but we acknowledge that our king is returning, yet it hasn't changed our worldview enough. Jesus has given us this promise of his return without a perfect timeline to create this sense of urgency in us so that we would shape how we view our lives, shape how we view opportunities, shape how we view what our families should look like, our workplace relationships, our schools. Right? It's a crisis because it cheapens what grace is to us. Right? It's not costly, but it's easy. It's not valuable, it's convenient. It leaves us looking a lot like the bad servants that he describes, who take for granted all that they have been entrusted with. And what costs God, his Son, cannot be cheap for me. Instead of this path that I think we naturally so frequently find ourselves in, of just taking for granted what God has given to us, that he wouldn't hold his Son, that wouldn't count his Son too costly a price to serve us, to have a relationship with us. Instead of that, Jesus offers us a different path, at the good servant path, where we go about our lives eagerly awaiting and arranging everything in light of the promise that our King is coming back to us. So simply, I leave you guys with this today as we close. Which servant are you right now? If you look at your life, are you ready for our King to come knocking at the door? The thought of Jesus coming to you today or tomorrow and seeing what you're doing with what he has given you, is it frightening? Is it exciting? To be clear, I think even the most focused and life-changed person among us would still have some level of fear or hesitation with the idea of Jesus coming to our door and evaluating our lives. Acknowledgement that there are areas in our life where all of us are struggling and falling short. It's not to say that the good servant is the perfect servant. That's why it's grace. But does your life reflect this inch and miles concept? Right? Are we taking steps that inch us closer towards Jesus? And are you receiving in return the miles of depth that God is offering to you? Right, that's the idea of the kingdom of heaven, as I've mentioned that term kingdom several times, is not that one day we'll be in heaven. It's that we get to experience heaven on earth now in our relationship with God, right? In that depth, that relationship that God offers to us. Right? That's the urgency that we need to be pursuing, that we get to experience the kingdom now, not just someday when we die. Right? Are we receiving that miles of depth? Meeting with God, being with him. Does your life reflect the imminency that Jesus is returning at a time that you don't know? So that we live a life that is immensely focused on his kingdom and not just our earthly kingdoms. Is it reflected in how we reach out to other people in light of the fact that we know that Jesus is returning? And ask yourselves these questions as we leave this week, recognizing that we all have messy, messy lives that God is intensely interested in. right? Intensely desiring of involvement in, intensely ready and happy in redeeming, and making our lives into something that demonstrates his glory. That's miraculous. And God provides miles of redemption. He provides the life-changing. Right? It doesn't take our miles, it takes our inches. God provides the depth. God provides the redeeming, costly grace for us because that is the king that we have. Right? That's the master that we serve, the one who would be a servant himself. And the king that will be returning again. A king who happily makes this exchange of miles if we only would give him our inches. You guys pray with me? God, just reflecting on that idea of costly grace, that primarily, before it even gets to us, it is costly because it cost you your son. And it is grace because you did not hold Jesus back from that. That you deemed us as broken and messy and as we are, that you deemed it worthy to sacrifice your son so you could have a relationship with us. Man, that's a paradigm shift I want in my understanding of you, God. I think that everyone in this church wants, as we consider what life should look like, the worldview we should have, that we would first consider that, man, you love us so much, with so much depth. There's so much there that we can have, so much value, so much joy, opposed to what we might pursue elsewise in this world. God, I pray that we be people who just live with that urgency because we have no idea when you're coming. That we wouldn't take Sunday mornings, we wouldn't take the next half hour or 45 minutes, the next week for granted, and we would just pursue you with urgency. God, we thank you for loving us in a way that we cannot repay, and exchanging our inches, our little steps of obedience for miles and miles of depth and love that we are not worthy of, but you give to us freely because you are so graceful. God, we thank you for that.